whether or not God exists. But to me, like all else being equal, it just seems to me like the like views that don't involve God are probably better. And I don't know, my own preferred view is I don't think that propositions are things that exist in the world. I take a similar approach to like numbers and mathematics. I think that numbers don't exist, and I think that um, so I take a deflationary nominalist view, one that's kind of championed by someone like Jody Azuni. Uh, like I think that that view seems pretty plausible to me. But yeah,
Yeah, so I think there's multiple ways you can respond to, empty world objections, right? So a way you can respond to empty world objections is just to say that um, maybe it would be the case that, there would be no proposition in that empty world. Um, Given that we're not isolating um the worlds from each other, right? So like if we were to posit like this kind of like an accessibility from one world to the next, then you might be able to say that the proposition exists in virtue of the mind or the perspective of the world that we're viewing the other world from, right? So like let's say that we have the actual world and we're viewing another possible world or another set of possible worlds from the actual world, and then we make like a proposition about this empty world. Maybe where this proposition would reside is the mind of the person in the actual world. So like maybe
yeah,
you can say that, but
that doesn't
yeah, there
work
might be
though.
problems with that. But
That doesn't work.
yeah,
If you take any a standard course on modal logic and you understand how truth values work at different worlds that are accessible to one world. Say we have W1, where W1 is the world which we think is the actual world, and then you have W2, and say that you're saying that the truth. Let's say we call the proposition that this is an empty world. Let's call that proposition P. If P, like what the claim that I was making was saying, it was just to sort of pump an intuition. It wasn't to get to a conclusion. It was just to pump the intuition that it seems to me that that proposition take a world that's almost empty, where the only proposition that and the only thing that exists in that world is this proposition, the following proposition. This world only contains this proposition. To me, that proposition seems true. And what and if that proposition is true, then it's not that it's true at some other world, because if it's true at some other world, well, then the proposition just isn't true. And again, like if W1 is the actual world, W2 is the world in which that proposition exists, and we're calling that proposition P. If P is true at W2, then and it's accessible to world one, then it would be it's either true at World One or not. And if it's not true at World One, well, then it's possibly true at World One. But it could also be actually true at World One too. But I mean that whether or not that's the case, that's independent from whether or not the proposition P is true at World Two.
yeah. So I guess I can respond to this because I was also gonna like give another point about like where that objection like might lead the argument, but I'll respond to this first. So um about like accessibility. So what I'm specifically saying here is that maybe you could have a world where the proposition is true, and it's not true in virtue of any other world. However, you might not be able to say that the proposition only exists in that world if we're not isolating the world, right? So like we can say that the proposition exists in multiple worlds, but whether the proposition is true in those worlds is actually dependent on the states of those worlds, right? So like maybe you can make a distinction between the truth of a proposition and whether that proposition exists. And so you might be able to say that maybe the proposition exists in some of the minds, or the proposition exists as this conceptual entity in some of the minds of some of the inhabitants of the set of possible worlds or the set of all possible worlds, and whether the propositions are true at the different worlds depends on the specific states or the specific contents of the world. And like to respond like to like lead on like the objection, I mean that was like a big point of the argument. So like a big point of the argument was to demonstrate that um obviously there's some propositions that like contingent minds can't entertain, because it's obviously not going to be the case that contingent minds exist in all possible worlds. So instead of like saying that uh we're asserting this view of propositional naturalism entirely, we're saying that propositions are entirely dependent on contingent minds. Maybe you can say that there's like a necessary intellect which can obviously entertain all propositions, given that the necessary intellect can exist at all possible worlds. And then, like, just to respond to Platonism point, I'd just say that like, Platonism is more unparsimonious, given that Platonism posits would have to posit like an infinite amount of propositions, or maybe an infinite amount of numbers, real numbers that are like ontologically distinct and ontologically exist on their own. However, under like a conceptualist view, specifically a conceptualist view concerning a necessary intellect, you don't have to posit an infinite amount of objects that exist on their own. You can just posit like the object within the mind of entity. And so you only posit really one being. However, under the Platonist view, you posit like an infinite amount of beings.
Yeah, well, I don't. Well, one, I think okay. Um, so it's too far. So far, there's only 2 points on the table. There's a point about Platonism. There's a point about these other world. I mean, the response to what I said about the possible world stuff, just to me, is not really a response at all. I mean, all that you're saying is just that, well, what would make those propositions true at those worlds is that there are minds. But if we're giving this example at the outset, that the only thing that exists at that world is that the proposition, that this is the only proposition that exists at this world or whatever, well then that possible world is an impossible world on this view, because according to the reply, there would have to be some necessary being that would make that proposition true. But there can't be such a world where that proposition is true, and you also have that necessary being. At least, like, I mean, that's just to deny the sort of world as a possible one. And I mean, that might be a move that you want to make, but I mean, it's not a reply. It would just be something that's kind of more questionable. I mean, that would fall. That would be a consequence of having the view that there are minds, that there is a necessary mind at that world. And then regarding the Platonism stuff, I don't actually see like uh, how the at least you haven't really sketched out the view so far, but I don't see how the divine conceptualist picture that you were kind of pushing towards really does any better. I mean, on the Platonist picture, you have one, these group of entities, call them abstract objects. So you're positing a new type of entity beyond, let's say, the natural world, assuming, because whether or not you're a theist, everyone's going to agree that the natural world exists, presumably. And then you might, ask whether or not there's other things. And if you think that there's good reason to think that there's abstract objects, well, then you'll posit them, maybe by virtue of like some indispensability argument or whatever. But to say that on theism you're positing one like necessary being, and that necessary being, like these abstract objects maybe exist in the mind of that entity. I mean, you're still going to posit like all those entities either way, plus the mind, So you don't get some advantage by saying, well, there's a mind that that unites all these abstract objects or whatever that are no longer abstract. Maybe they're just like, I mean, I don't even. They would have to be abstract in some sense if you think that God is non-physical, but maybe still can causally interact with the world. Um, like they exist presumably in some sense. And if they're like non-causal, they're non-spatial. I mean, they sound a lot like abstract objects. I'm not sure what the difference would be. And it also doesn't seem clear to me that you would be positing less entities. I mean, you're positing still the same entities, but it's just like under, I don't know, different guise.
Yeah, so to respond to, the things you said about the empty world, because obviously I acknowledge that the propositions, you know, would only be able to be true at that empty world, but I'm skeptical of the fact that you'd only be able to say that the proposition, because if we're not isolating, the possible, and we're saying that every possible is accessible from the other, and let's say that we have a mind who can access this possible world, we literally just posit that the proposition, exists within the mind of this thing. So we could just posit that, let's say we have like a finite amount of propositions, not an infinite amount of them. Let's say we have a finite amount of propositions. And technically we could ground the existence of all those propositions in in some mind across the set of all possible worlds, given that like, a mind exists at a few of these worlds at a time. So let's just stipulate
But
like a mind
wait,
exists at a few of these worlds at a time.
but do you get the point about how that the world that I gave in the example would be an impossible world if this is the move that you're making?
Yeah, if I'm yeah, like if I was going to make the necessary intellect move, um yeah, then it might be an impossible world, like under that view. Um, but like we wouldn't be saying, because we wouldn't be saying that the proposition is true in virtue of the necessary intellect having the proposition in its mind. We're saying that um, the proposition can just be true in virtue of like the state of that world. However,
Yeah.
where the proposition, what entity would actually entertain the proposition would be a necessary intellect.
Yeah, but that's still an impossible world. Like, given that response, that would still be an impossible world. Do you see why that is?
Okay, so um, the explanation was it would be an impossible world, given that you have to posit, uh, another entity in the empty world. Is that what you're saying?
Well, the reason that possible world would be impossible is because in the way that I set it up was, you suppose you have a world that's like near, like almost empty, and the only thing that exists in that world is the following proposition. Uh, this is the only proposition that exists, or it doesn't matter what the proposition is, but suppose that it just says this proposition is the only thing that exists at this world. Okay, now if you were to say, well, that proposition could be true if you have some mind in that world that is, making it true. Um, yeah, you could, if you say that, well, then that proposition turns out to be false. And even putting aside that it turns out to be false because it's not the only thing that exists. That proposition exists, and the mind in which it's being, I don't know, in which it inhabits is also something that exists. So the proposition ends up being false, but also to make that move would be to say that you can't have such a world in which only that proposition exists because that proposition needs to be grounded by some mind. So that means that world can exist because on that the view that, not the view, the example that I gave, the only thing that exists in that world is just that proposition. But now the only, if the response is just to say, well, you have to have this like necessary mind where it makes it true. Well, then now you don't have that, just that proposition. You have something else.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I think I get what you're saying. So yeah, I think I get like how the possible world would be an impossible world, given that you're stipulating that like a necessary intellect would, have to entertain the proposition. But like I don't see the problem with positing that like that type of possible world, would be an impossible world. Um, like because you know, I think you might say that in terms of, let's say that we're talking about like logical modality, like maybe if you make a distinction between logical and metaphysical modality, you could say that maybe it's like logically possible, maybe it's like possible theoretically. But yeah, I don't see how that type of world would be possible. I mean, like given the semantics of my views that I already take, since I take like I take it to be the fact that abstract objects aren't the type of things that we should entertain. I was like, if abstract objects aren't the type of things that we should entertain, how would we be to assert that a proposition exists in that world without entertaining the existence of abstract objects?
Wait, could you restate the last question? But I also want to make clear that we can move past the example of the empty world case because that was the only reason I brought that up was to try to get the intuition that like that proposition would seem to be true, but its truth value would be not something that depends on like minds or whatever. Um,
Yeah.
and I take it that if like the reason you think that they depend on minds isn't something that's like just analytically true of propositions, right?
I don't think it's analytically true of propositions.
Okay.
However,
Yeah.
I think that like a mental account would best explain the properties that propositions have.
Yeah, okay. So we can move past that example. You think it's an impossible world per the view. So
Yeah.
now I guess yeah, what was the last question that you had asked? Um
Um, no, I think we were still on the Platonism point, specifically.
yeah. Well the
So
point
like,
about yeah.
yeah,
So what did you have to say with respect to what
yeah.
I had
So
mentioned
in
before
respect,
about feminism?
yeah. Like in the respect of like the Platonism point, I don't see like how you'd be positing, that the same type of entity exists in the same way, right? Like for example, it seems that when I say that a car exists in the mind and a car exists in reality, maybe I'm still positing the existence of a car, but maybe I'm positing the existence of a car, conceptually, and maybe I'm positing it in like as an actual object that exists in reality. And so if Platonists would probably want to posit like abstract objects is things that don't just exist conceptually, but things that exist like independent of the mind in reality, in like a third realm. But like that would seem like less parsimonious because it seems more parsimonious to posit that these objects exist conceptually, it seems like you make less ontological commitments when you say like the conceptual existence of objects rather than the actual existence of objects.
Yeah. I think at least the way that you described it, the move, if you were to say, well, if Platonists aren't going to grant that they also exist in minds, but exist in reality, I think that distinction, if that's a distinction that you want to hold on as like a part of your view, that you think that God exists and these things exist conceptually, but they don't exist maybe in some other way. Well, it seems to me that you're invoking this notion of ontological pluralism. And by ontological pluralism, I just mean the view that existence can be cashed out differently by maybe different objects or something like that. So maybe fictional characters exist differently. There's like different modes of being. And I take that thesis to not really be intelligible. I'm not sure what it means to say that things exist differently. I can understand saying that things have different properties. Like if there's, let's say if there's abstract objects, maybe they're non-spatial, they're non-causal. Like I can understand, but I don't know what it means to say that they exist in some other way. And I think that thesis is pretty ontologically cost like it's pricey, at least up to me, because I don't know, you have to invoke that there's this other way that things exist, and you're also including this being that you're that's like a necessary mind, and now these things exist conceptually in the mind of this being. So it seems to me that you're invoking a new notion of existence, perhaps, and you're also invoking the same entities, but maybe they're just like different, like they exist differently. But I don't see that being like saving you any, like giving you any parsimony. That to me doesn't. That, if anything, that is more costly to me. Like you actually are, you're opening up the economy, so to speak. You're not closing it by in saving. Um, but yeah,
Yeah, like maybe, look, what I meant there is specifically that maybe when we like assign like the predicate of existence to certain objects, I'm not sorry to certain objects 'cause I don't take it to be a first order
do you mean the
predicate.
quantifier?
We um
Because
yeah, I mean
existence.
I
I
think of
mean,
existence as like a second order predicate. Um
okay,
like something that we don't assign to objects in of themselves, but something that we assign to like the concept of an object. So like when I say that X exists, I just mean that X is instantiated, like the concept of X is instantiated, something like
yeah.
that.
But do you think that quantifier gets would there be different uses of that quantifier, given that you think that things can exist conceptually versus in
I
reality?
mean,
Because you made that
maybe, because
distinction.
I mean, yeah, maybe, because like maybe like not okay, maybe yeah, different uses of the quantifier, right? So like maybe when I say that numbers exist, I mean to say a different thing than cars exist. Um, or when I say that a car exists in my mind, I mean to say a different thing than saying that a car exists in reality.
Okay.
But I don't actually. I mean, I think there might be concerns about the ontological pluralism being less parsimonious, but I actually think that it might not be less parsimonious if you like consider the type of explanatory power that ontological pluralism might yield. So like, I think it like can solve certain.
Parsimony
Um,
is independent of explanatory power. So I mean,
I mean,
you can have like you can tell that you can give an explanatory story about what role these like objects do, and even if they exist different, like in some other sense. But that's like independent about concerns of parsimony.
yeah, what I meant to say there, what I meant to say specifically is just that maybe maybe the lack of parsimony on the view would not affect the view simplicator because of the amount of explanatory power. So maybe we do actually need to posit like these sorts of entities to explain the data at hand. So like maybe it wouldn't actually maybe like the parsimony of the view wouldn't actually hurt the view in of itself.
No, well, look, this seems like really weird to me because the concern with Platonism was, well, Platonism isn't parsimonious. Presumably, Platonism has the explanatory power to account for the data, and if there are numbers, well, then if they exist, where do they exist? I don't know. Maybe some Platonic realm. The same thing with propositions, but maybe you think that that's too high of a price to pay when it comes to your ontological cost. So you
I
think
mean,
that
yeah,
well, there's this. Yeah, so if you think that there's this issue with
I think
parsimony, I don't think that invoking some another sense of existence and invoking a mind where like now there's this new sense of existence in the mind of this being, and you still have the same objects, but they just exist in this other way. I don't think that that is really, I don't see how that's an explanatory advantage, much
I
less
mean,
an advantage regarding like ontological parsimony. To me, that just seems more of a cost on both fronts.
I think what I'm specifically doing here, just I'm trying to compare the two views. So like maybe like I could say that maybe I could stipulate that both the views have like equal explanatory power. However, like one view is like very posits much more entities. But like given that, we don't have any like substantial reason to posit that many entities as it's not doing any explaining like the alternative hypothesis. But like I think okay, what I specifically mean when I say that, it exists conceptually or it exists in reality is similar to how like a Platonist would say that an object exists as concreta, like an object exists as abstracta. Maybe
Yeah,
we mean to say that they do exist in the same way. Maybe we mean to say they exist in the same way. However,
okay,
we just assign different properties to the thing um, specifically.
okay. So, so are you then conceding on the point about ontological pluralism? Because that's what it sounded like to
Basically
me. It
just
sounded like
yeah.
to me that you could, because if you're saying it, if you're saying that you could have your view be similar to what, like when you say abstract objects exist versus when you say concrete objects exist, the Platonists like they could be committed to the ontological monism and say that, well, the only thing that there's only one sense of existence, and if that's the move that you're making, then it seems to me that you're retracting from saying that things can exist conceptually versus in reality. Is that what you're doing? Are you conceding on that point?
I'm not necessarily conceding. All I'm saying is that like you could take. I think the view that I'm articulating is compatible with both, and I think that we,
Yeah.
if to take either way, like you wouldn't be hurting, like you wouldn't be substantially hurting, like the theoretical,
Okay.
how virtuous the view is.
Okay. Yeah, if you take the view that if you deny ontological pluralism, I think that that makes the view that you have better. But I mean, okay, sure, it's compatible, but the point wasn't about incompatibility. The point was about the cost that you have for your theory. But like just saying that, well, I could change my theory. Yeah, sure, you could do that. And I don't know. I'm not really too concerned with what sort of options you have. I kind of want to know what you think is true about the theory, not just like what sort of theoretical options are available to you.
I mean, I don't think that like I'm persuaded on like either side of the debate between like ontological pluralism and monism. I think that like both of them have their own independent virtues, but like um the ontologies that I'm most interested in, I like do subscribe to like ontological pluralism, kind of like Aristotelian. I'm a fan of like Aristotelian ontologies, like they subscribe to pluralism, and so like the
Yeah.
ontologies that I've exposed myself to the most have like subscribed to, like these pluralist views, but I haven't really seen like any substantial motivation for ontological monism. So yeah, maybe I just need to
Check out
wait.
Trenton Merrick's paper, "The Only Way to Be," published in Journal News. He gives reasons to think that ontological pluralism uh, is false. But I mean, okay, you're just saying that you don't have a settled opinion. But do you agree that the point about pluralism that I raise does raise additional concerns that you wouldn't have if you take a sort of monistic view about existence?
Yeah, I'd agree to that, but the only problem is that like it would be unclear how we'd articulate certain sentences under like ontological monism. So like it would make our like semantics, it would make like how we use our semantics like very tricky. Like it
Wait,
might
why?
like induce because example, let's say that somebody comes up to you and says that numbers exist, and they say that okay, what like in what sense do you think numbers exist? And you say, oh, I think they exist in the mind. And then you say that, and then they say that, or I think cars exist, or I think that dogs exist. And they ask you, okay, what sense do you think dogs exist? They're gonna give you like a different sense or a different way of how these things exist, right? So like maybe
Wait,
we have like
who is
semantic
going to give you
concerns
that?
about monism.
Wait, who's going to give you that? Like, who's going to give you a different way? I mean, that's like an empirical question that I think is just open. I don't know that that's, I don't think that there's been any experimental philosophy done on what people would say and how the semantics would be used. I think people might describe you different properties that the things have. The whether or not they would give you a different sense of existence is not obvious, and I don't think it's a settled question.
No, because like I'm not
I
saying
I
like
take
this is like yeah.
Well, I mean, you said it would cause trouble for our semantics, and this was the example that
Yeah.
you gave, that someone would do that. But I'm saying that
I mean, no,
that's it's not
I'm saying
obvious.
that like I'm saying that like normally like in these situations, we seem to say that things exist in like a different sense. Like for example,
Yeah,
well,
and
let's say
that's the
that
thing that I'm disputing.
yeah.
That's not
I
obvious,
mean, like
and
yeah. I mean,
just giving this as
like I was
like
gonna
conceptual example isn't that's an empirical claim that requires, empirical investigation. Unless you have that,
because I
then
was
just giving me an example isn't going to be conclusive.
no, because I was like basically just saying that like if you have a conceptualist and like uh if you have a conceptualist and they're gonna say that maybe numbers exist but they exist in the mind and then and if you know they'll also say that objects exist independent of the mind. It's like they might say that
Yeah,
objects exist conceptually and objects exist like, mind independently. But like there's gonna be obviously questions about okay, if monism is true, how can you possibly say things exist conceptually and things exist concretely? Like how can you talk about existence in different senses? And so
in the
like I'm
same
not
way that you
necessarily
can
making like
talk
an empirical
about
claim.
it would be in the same way that you can say that I exist and that you exist. Well, in what sense do we exist? Well, I mean, what could you be asking by that? Like, one thing that you might be asking is, like, what makes it true that those objects are instantiated? And if you say that there's things that are instantiated, let's say, for example, thoughts. And let's say we think that thoughts are conceptual items. And so why do thoughts exist? Well, and they depend on mind, so they're mind dependent objects. But does that mean that thoughts somehow have this some other sense of existence? No, maybe the way that they're brought about is differently, but that doesn't mean that they exist in some different way. That you therefore like maybe change maybe you like I don't know. It doesn't mean that you would have uh, you would have different properties, but it doesn't seem to me that you would have to say that, well, there's this other sense of existence, just because the way that this thing came about was brought about differently. I mean, because if that's the motivation behind it, well, then, objects that exist ordinarily, physical objects, are brought about by different sorts of causes. There's like, but that doesn't therefore like give you motivation to think that there's a different sense in which they exist, just because maybe some physical objects are brought about by certain natural phenomenon and other objects are brought about by other natural phenomena. It doesn't give you reason to think that there's a different sense in which they exist. Likewise, just because some objects might depend on minds for their existence, it doesn't seem clear to me that that gives you reason to think that there's some other sense of existence. Like maybe there's another sense in which these like there's like different truth conditions that need to be held for like that object to be instantiated. That might be true, but that's completely independent of whether or not uh, there's a different sense of existence. And the only thing that you've brought up is maybe merits motivation to think that they I don't know, require something else to exist, but it doesn't seem that it merits any motivation to think that they require some other sense of existence.
Okay, so are you basically just saying that maybe the predicate of existence is not the thing that's distinguished, but maybe the conditions for how these things come about is like the distinguishing factor that we can make between certain objects?
What I was saying was that, like, because you raised a concern about, like, well, it seems like we might have like semantic issues if we say that some objects um, exist conceptually in the sense that they depend on minds and other objects are mind independent. Yeah, but I took that like I take the if something is true mind independently, or if it's true and it depends on minds, or if something existence depends on the existence of minds, I take that to be, a fact about, what are the conditions that are required for that object to obtain. But I take that to be something like what conditions are required for any object to obtain to be something that doesn't, merit any motivation to think that is there different senses in which objects exist. Like I think that those two questions are like maybe not completely independent, but they're largely independent of each other. Um, and I took it that what you brought up was only, I don't know, concerning, like it could be answered through answering the question about like what conditions need to be held for that object to exist, not does it exist in some other sense. I don't know if that's clear, but
Okay, so like are you saying like the existence conditions are different?
yeah, I mean, like
Conditions.
the conditions that are required for you to exist are different than the conditions that are required for me to exist. Presumably, you had different parents, you have different DNA, blah blah blah, but that doesn't merit any, you know, like I said, I don't know. It doesn't give you any reason to think that we exist in different senses just because there's different conditions that are required to bring us about. Likewise, if thoughts exist, there's different conditions that need to be met for a thought to exist and for, let's say, a car to exist. But that doesn't mean that they exist in different senses. If they exist, then to me they exist outright, and that's it. What's required for them to exist? Well, that's going to be settled by different conditions and whether or not those conditions are met.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense then. I think like I mean, I was gonna bring like up the issue about like fictional like Meinongian objects, right? So like under like a Meinongian view of objects, right, you'd say that non-existent objects are like the non-existence of something is a state of affairs. Like the non-existence of like any given object, like the non-existence of a kite is a state of affairs. It's like, do you think that like under a Meinongian view, like that would assume ontological pluralism? Like, would you say like that would be like an ontological monist view?
I think it might depend on the particular way that they're kind of understanding existence. If they think that um, if they think that fictional objects and, let's say, concrete objects and abstract objects can all be talked about under the same, maybe, let's say we have different senses of the existential quantifier. If they think that all the relevant objects can be captured by the same quantifier, well, then they might not, they I don't see that they would have to be a pluralist. But if they think that you would have to maybe use a different sense of like a different kind of quantifier to talk about fictional objects, then yeah, they might be. But I don't know. It'll depend on the details of the sort of Meinernian picture in question.
Yeah, then I think the last thing I wanted to talk about was like another type of, argument for the existence of God. So it's like a similar one, but it doesn't hinge on like anything about thoughts. Like it's basically one that hinges on S5. So it basically says that, it's possible, let's just assume like for the sake of the argument that it's possible for there to be like an empty world with no concrete objects. And like if you accept accessibility and if you accept like these sort of intuitions about S5, if it's possible for there to be an empty world, and given the fact that, we accept this principle that something cannot come from nothing, then it would also be the case that in every world, nothing exists, right? Given how like the accessibility relations between the worlds would work. And so if that's like if in every world nothing exists, there seems to be like an obviously absurd conclusion because it's clear
Yeah.
that something does exist. So, like maybe we'd have to posit there are no empty worlds. But if we posit there are no empty worlds, that means that we posit like there is a thing in that exists in every possible world, which just seems to be positing the existence of a necessary thing.
Uh, no, I mean I don't think that the way like the accessibility relation would work isn't that uh like to me, this assumes a particular view about not just accessibility, but the way that the accessibility relation would hold across these possible worlds. So you can have different theories of modality where you can, the accessibility relation is one that fits the description of S5, where all worlds are accessible to one another. But how you parse out accessibility will be different. So, for example, in the sort of contemporary space of philosophy of religion, in the when people talk about modal cosmological arguments, some modal cosmological arguments, like Proust and Rasmussen's modal argument from beginnings in their 2018 book, that argument specifically depends on branching actualism, which is the view that in every possible world there's this initial sort of kind of state from which all the other worlds, possible worlds, like they all have the same sort of initial, modal history, but they diverge maybe where different possibilities play out. So that's one way in which you might think that all possible worlds are accessible to one another. But that need not be the only way. You could think that there's possible. You could still think that there's empty worlds, and they might be accessible to the actual world. But you might think that, I don't know, the accessibility relation need not be one that's held by some sort of branching actualist view. Like, I don't know. Like, to me, it seems obvious that that's not true. I mean, it's obviously not logically required. Like, but yeah, I don't know. If you think that that's like the only way to have that picture, I think you would need to motivate that sort of actualist theory of modality. Um,
I mean, yeah, I think there are like other ways to respond to the argument because, like, I mean, a popular way to actually argue, and like there is, because some people wouldn't even grant that, there are some people wouldn't like accept the intuition that like that that there are no empty worlds. So they might okay, so some people wouldn't accept that just because things exist in every world that there is a necessary thing. Like so because some people like reject like subtraction arguments. So like a subtraction argument would just be saying like you if you minus an object from the set of all things constantly, then you'll have a world where there is no things. But like somebody might say that what if there's an object that just entails the existence of another object? Like back to my non-ontology, what if the non-existence of an object is itself like a state of affairs? So like maybe you can posit that there are no necessary things, but things exist in every possible world without needing to posit like a necessary being.
I mean, I don't know what this doesn't do anything for your argument, and I don't see like why this matters. Like at all. Like, I mean, sure. I mean, this, like, I don't know why you brought up the issue about empty worlds again. I mean, this is just like I don't see how this like it has anything to do with what we were talking about before. I mean, initially
I was just
the
saying
point
that
about
it
empty
might be. I was just saying that it might be a response to like a potential response to the argument, because like it would reject the intuition that yeah, if we posit the existence of things in every possible world, that we need to accept that there's a necessary thing. Like maybe we could posit the existence of contingent things in all possible worlds without accepting like there's a necessary thing.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, what about that though? I mean, that doesn't what does that have
Yeah,
to do with propositions, and what does that have to do with
no,
propositions
because I was
existing
saying that like
requiring
no, I was saying that like was I was saying that was like a second argument, like an independent argument from the first one.
Okay, it's well, okay, so what's the conclusion of that argument? Because I don't think what that people might not have the intuition that there's empty worlds. Is that the conclusion? Because if so, then yeah, I agree. But I
The
mean, okay.
conclusion of like the conclusion of like the argument I just gave now, because it was in reference to like the other argument about the argument I just gave like not too long ago about if there's a thing in every possible world, or if it's impossible that there are any empty worlds, then there's a necessary thing. I was saying that this
Yeah, I
response
mean
that I
that
just gave
argument's
might be
invalid, but
a
yeah.
potential response. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I
I
was
mean
just
the
saying that like
argument that wait, go ahead.
I was just saying that that might be a potential response to the argument I just gave.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, if you're raising a potential objection to your argument, sure. Yeah, yeah, that is a potential. I mean, the argument is invalid if you think that a necessary being exists because at every world something exists. I mean, that's just straightforwardly invalid. Um, but yeah, I mean, okay, yeah, that's a potential way to respond, but I don't see how that connects to uh, the argument about uh, propositions requiring minds.
I mean, yeah, like the thing about the propositions requiring minds was like you know, if you want to establish that there is like a necessary intellect, but obviously, like, I just wanted to hear your thoughts about it because, like, obviously, since you disagree with, obviously, you disagree with, I'm pretty sure, was it the thing about propositions requiring minds, like proposition being these mental objects? If you disagree
Yeah.
with that, then yeah, obviously, like, the argument wouldn't be able to go through. Um, like other formulations of the argument, like another formulation just basically goes like propositions essentially represent, and then only agents fundamentally represent. So like maybe propositions like derive their representationality from agents. If that's the case, then and then you'd also posit these transcendent propositions. So a transcendent proposition is just a proposition that can't be entertained by a finite intellect. And given that you might just be able to get to the conclusion that and there's like a necessary intellect that fundamentally represents um,
Yeah, I don't know, but I don't think that. I mean, I don't think that that argument works. I mean, you have like people who hold to like structured accounts of propositions where the representation of propositions are just accounted by those structured propositions, and I don't know. I think that view is like one that's on the table that you could possibly have. So like this is like a view that like Bertrand Russell held, um, but I don't like I don't know. I don't think that like I would need to see an argument for the claim that propositions because if they are, I would agree that propositions maybe some like that they are representation on the sense that maybe they're about things like the proposition that there is a tree. Um, or there are trees like that proposition, yeah, it's about maybe the content of the proposition's trees, but I don't think that just because like, well, if we observe what other things in the world are representational in that sense, I don't know, maybe like thoughts of human beings or whatever, beliefs or blah blah blah. Like I don't see like there needs to be an argument for the connection there. Like um
I mean, yeah,
'cause I don't know. 'Cause I'm
I
fine
mean,
with
yeah, I haven't really.
having a primitive sort of notion of representation that that is defended by like someone like Trent Merrick's. Like I think that like his sort of primitive notion of representation is one that's seemingly plausible to me. But
Yeah, so I mean, from because the paper or the specific book that I read this argument from was the Plantinga project, like the 2 dozen arguments for God thing. Um, like 'cause when she was explaining the argument, so I think I can't remember her first name, but last name was Keller. When she was explaining the argument, it's like assumed premise one to be like true, just to be like analytically true. I think she also like assumed the truth of the premise two as well. It's like she didn't even give any justification for premise one and premise two. It's like she didn't give any justification for why propositions essentially represent, and also why agents only fundamentally represent. Um, so yeah, they kind of just assume those two premises to be true in virtue of
yeah, well,
themselves.
I mean, I'm fine with saying that propositions essentially are representational, but I don't know. I think that the fact that they're representational isn't because they're related to this other thing by like in virtue of like they're being related to this mind. Like I think that whether or not they're representational is independent of any like relation that it has to things outside of it. Um, you know, like this is why I also think that like if you think that there are like objective moral truths, why appealing to what God's like sort of opinions about it is kind of irrelevant, because the moral like the to me whether if there are objective moral truths, I don't think that their truth depends upon these sort of attitudes about like some other being or like what relation holds between them and the attitudes of some other being. Like I think that seems to me just straightforwardly false. And but again, that's a separate concern. But here, it's the same sort of thing. I don't what if they're representational. To me, that's independent of whether or not they have some other relation to minds or not.
I mean, yeah, like about the moral truth thing. I was actually having a conversation today with somebody who thought that divine command theory entails moral realism, and then um, they thought that the reason why divine command theory entails moral realism is because God would like present these categorical reasons that come from his commands. But I told him that like, like maybe um the fact that these commands are dependent on God's attitudes and God's mental attitudes, right, would be pointing towards the fact that it's not actually a form of realism, a form of like subjectivism or like a form of anti-realism. Because like a realism would hold that these objective truths or objective facts that aren't true in virtue of any agent. However, like in divine command theory, you'd have to posit like there's an agent that makes these things true. I was like the truth maker for the proposition. Like, yeah, I don't think there's much else to speak about. I mean, yeah, I think